I'm Professor Longo, and I wanted to do a couple of webinars focused on diabetes, particularly in cardiovascular disease and risk factors. And so the first part, the first module, will be focused on, here's my disclosure. So the first part, just very brief introduction on aging and health span and why we take this approach. And then the genetics of aging, and then I'll talk about calorie restriction, protein restriction, and low carb and ketogenic diets. So this is the module number 1, which I'm going to focus on today. And then module number 2, I'm going to focus on intermittent fasting, alternate day, 2 days a week of fasting, time restricted eating, the fasting mimicking diet, and then the longevity diet. So why aging? Why is aging so important? Because obviously aging is the major risk factor for many different diseases, and also the aging is at the foundation for frailty, and so we now have been very successful in the last 100 years in extending extending lifespan, but we have not been very successful in extending healthy lifespan. And so now we have this very long lifespan. We have lots of centenarians, record numbers of centenarians in many parts of the world. But now the typical 65-year-old is living with multiple chronic diseases, and the typical 65-year-old, but even 55-year-old, is living, taking multiple drugs, and in many cases, many drugs, right? So how do we extend the health span? So how do we extend the healthy lifespan? And so COVID has been a great example, underlining the vulnerability of the old, but also underlining the vulnerability of those with age-related diseases. So you see here that in the case of COVID, mortality from 30 to 80, you have this exponential increase in the risk of mortality for those infected with COVID. But also you see this much higher risk compared to the general population in those that have cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, all age-related diseases. So why is this? Well, a number of age-associated factors. So inflammation, immunosenescence, frailty. So together, now these individuals are much higher risk of dying of COVID compared to everyone else. Okay, so then genetics of aging. Why is it so important to demonstrate that a gene or a pathway can revolutionize essentially not only lifespan but also health span? Because I think, and this was done by a group of us in the 90s, and I think that the genetics of aging, to have a mutation that can make an organism or many different organisms live a lot longer and a lot healthier, it provides a real demonstration that for how is aging involved in the disease, and also what are the mechanisms for a particular disease. So I think that if you look at, I organized a conference a number of years ago and asked some of the leading geneticists of aging, what are the most important genes affecting lifespan, and those that I'm showing here came out on top. So growth hormone and IGF-1, and also Taurusis kinase. So the geneticists felt that the research in the last 30 years mostly has really provided a strong evidence for the role of these pathways in aging and age-related diseases. And so the growth hormone, the growth pathways were clearly involved. At the bottom on the left, you see the dot and those are simple organisms, microorganisms. And this comes from my own lab many years ago, and just looking by searching for all the genes that the yeast express, the ones that causes the biggest lifespan extension and the biggest effects against aging was in fact mutations in the TOR-S6 kinase pathway. And the flies in the center have mutation in the insulin signaling pathway. And on the right, you see the little mice, and the little mice have mutation in the growth hormone receptor, and also either deficiency of growth hormone or deficiency of growth hormone receptor leads to record lifespan extension. Now, to many healthcare professionals, hearing this is very surprising because growth hormone is used for patients, it is used as an anti-aging strategy, but it turns out that even though growth hormone and IGF-1 can have very important roles, acute roles, in the long run, having high levels of growth hormone, high level of IGF-1, high level of insulin, high level of TOR signaling, it causes an acceleration of the aging process and also an acceleration or an increased incidence of many diseases. In fact, these little mice that you see there, not only do they live 40% longer just by having deficiency of the growth hormone receptor or growth hormone, they also display remarkable protection against diseases. So they, about half of them will get to this very long lifespan with no diseases being observed, and versus less than 10% of the mice that have normal growth hormone, right? So a tremendous difference in aging, longevity, and health span. So what about people? And so we have been following the people in Ecuador, and not just in Ecuador, with equivalent mutation. They have growth hormone receptor deficiency, same as the little mice at the bottom of the screen. And sure enough, these little people, and this is work that we've done in collaboration with Jaime Guevara, the endocrinologist that you see at the center of the screen. I always say that this group does not have a healthy lifestyle. And this is very important because, it's not good for them, but it really shows that the power of the genes, the anti-aging genes. And so this group of people, there's about 100 of them in Ecuador. They have mutations in the growth hormone receptor, and they have a pretty bad lifestyle, meaning that they eat a lot, they don't really watch what they eat, they don't exercise, they drink frequently, and so we would expect them to have a short lifespan and to have lots of diseases, but that's not what we see. And so if you look at cancer deaths, and this is just not just the Ecuador cohort, there is also Laron's, these GHRDs in Europe and in the Middle East, and you see that the cancer deaths are very, very low. So far, we've only observed one cancer death in many years or decades of observation. And also on the right, you see obesity. In spite of having an increased prevalence of obesity, their diabetes is very low. And I think, again, it's very important, these parallels with the mouse. So the mouse is protected from cancer. The mouse that have growth hormone deficiency is protected from cancer. The mouse is also protected from diabetes. And both the mice and the people are protected from age-related cognitive decline. So these are important. This conservation is important. Okay, so if you look at the interventions, the calorie restriction is being the most powerful and widely studied intervention. And what is calorie restriction? Well, first of all, a real problem due to eating too much in the United States, and not just the United States, in many different countries around the world. You see the prevalence of the obesity starting in 1985, ending in 2009. And it's a very important thing is that this increase in the obesity prevalence, this incredible increase in the obesity prevalence in the United States has been seen both during the low-fat periods, right? So it was a period where everything was low-fat. And then we went from low-fat to low-carb, and the obesity kept increasing. In the low-fat, in fact, in the low-fat period, people ate less fat. And in the low-carb period, which is continuing now, people eat less carbs. But this is not affected, this increase in obesity, suggesting that it's really not about fat or carbs. It's clearly due to calories, although, of course, not all the calories are equivalent, but overall the problem is the calories, and from this calorie restriction. Now, keep in mind that so calorie restriction is important. So keep in mind that there is both an effect on aging and an effect on obesity, which are very much connected, but not necessarily the same. So aging, here you see the protein signaling on the left, which we just talked about, growth hormone, IGF-1, taurusis kinase. On the right, you have the sugars, and the sugars can have an effect on aging signaling in many different cell types, but the sugars and the proteins and the fats together can lead to the obesity that I just showed you, and that leads to insulin resistance. And this insulin resistance now can contribute in a different way to the aging process by increasing insulin levels, but also increasing potentially IGF-1 levels and signaling, and taurusis kinase levels and signaling. Right. So there is a true pro-aging effect that is independently of the obesity and the overweight, and then there is a insulin resistance, obesity effect that, and these two very much contribute, cooperate to accelerate aging and age-related diseases. So what's calorie restriction? It's actually what is not, calorie restriction does not have to do with lowering calories for those that are overweight and obese. It really has to do with the fundamental effects on the aging process, independently of obesity. And so this would be a reduction, in most cases for humans, of 15 to 25% of calories below the normal intake. And so clearly this is a very low-calorie diet for, let's say, the US population. And this, though, is the idea of calorie restriction is to have this 15-25% reduction of calories without malnutrition. So the subjects in many of the clinical trials that have been run are fed an appropriate level of proteins, an appropriate level of vitamins and minerals, etc. And so I'll start with the monkey study and then move to the human. This study was done by Richard Weindruck at the University of Wisconsin, and then Rosalind Anderson and others. And so this is about 25% calorie restriction the monkeys were subjected to, and the results, I think, are really remarkable. Insulin resistance and diabetes go from 60% on the animals on a normal diet. And again, keep in mind, this is a Western-like diet, but this is not an excess diet. So these animals were fed a relatively normal calorie diet, and develops 60% of them develop diabetes or insulin resistance, and this goes down to 5% in the calorie-restricted monkeys. Tumors are reduced by 50% in the calorie-restricted monkeys, and cardiovascular disease is reduced by 20 to 30%. Now, if you look at the center, A says age-related mortality, and so this is mortality due to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. But B is all-cause mortality, and you see that the survival curves are getting much closer to each other. suggesting there are trade-offs, right? So then the calorie restriction is pushing these monkeys to the limit. They're definitely not dying of diabetes, they're not dying of cardiovascular disease, or they're dying less of cardiovascular disease and less of tumors, but they have other problems, and we don't even know what those other problems are. Could it be, for example, susceptibility to infectious diseases, right? COVID, the flu, etc., etc. Now, these monkeys have an advantage, right? Because they kept very much protected from viruses. I mean, they can still get viruses, but they're more protected. So, what will happen if they were out in the normal environment? Now, they potentially the infections will go much higher, and that mortality will get even worse. So what about humans? And so Roy Walford, my mentor, you see the bald doctor at the bottom of the screen, this was the first study on calorie restriction, human calorie restriction, 8 people, this done 30 years ago. But since then, many studies have been done confirming these original results. And so, not surprisingly, people that underwent a let's say 20-25% calorie restriction, they had reduced markers for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and these are just some of them. And you see where it says pre, that's before they enter biosphere 2, and when they enter this environment in the desert of Arizona, they became calorie restricted, so they start eating a very low calorie diet, about 1800 calories per day, and you see the BMI goes down, and you also see the systolic blood pressure. You see the first line after it says pre, it shows a big drop in systolic blood pressure going from 110 to 90. Glucose level dropped from about 90 to about 65, 70. Cholesterol level drop from 185 to 125. So really remarkable results on cardiovascular risk factors, and then but then if you look at Roy Walford on the left is during the calorie restricted period in biosphere 2, and then Walford on the right is much healthier, and so clearly the calorie restriction pushes the subjects to the limit and maybe over the limit. And this, if we look at mouse data, so again, it's been studied for 100 years. Calorie restriction is very effective in extending lifespan, but is it in all the genetic background? So you see, these are mice. There were many different genetic backgrounds because they were mixed genetically, and you see the green representing the strong positive effects of lifelong calorie restriction on mice, and you see now this gray is representing the neutral effects, and each column represents a different genetic background. And then the red are the genetic background for which calorie restriction is actually negative, right? And so you have positive, neutral, and negative effects. And this is really the reality of extreme chronic extreme dietary intervention. They can have all three, and you could argue that in most cases the effects were neutral. So then how do we so what's the point here? The point is that the effects of calorie restriction can be truly revolutionary, right? But in most cases they're not, right? So then if they can be, but most of the times they're not, how do we get these effects on diabetes and cancer and cardiovascular disease without these obvious problems and side effects that are bringing back the lifespan to normal, and in some cases, even in mice, are making lifespan shorter. So their calorie restriction is actually shortening the lifespan of many genetic background. And that's what I just said, right? So the beneficial effects really tremendous. It's teaching us that health span can be revolutionized, lifespan can be extended, people can be much healthier, but we just gotta get better at not causing problems while we're trying to not solving some problems while causing other problems. Okay, so what about if we narrow this and we go into a specific type of restriction, which is protein restriction, and remember the proteins are controlling growth hormone, IGF-1, they're controlling TOR, cis-kinase, really at the center of the growth genes that are so important for lifespan and health span. And so when this group in Australia took thousands of mice and they basically said, let's just use all kinds of diets, high protein, low carbohydrate, low protein, high carbohydrate, low protein, high fat. And so, which one is the best? Which one makes, without having an opinion about it, which one makes the mice live the longest and healthiest, right? So they looked at food intake, fat, storage, metabolic health, and lifespan. And you see if you have lots of people now adopting a high protein, low carbohydrate diet, you have less food intake, which is very much consistent with what lots of doctors and healthcare professionals use it for. So yes, you eat less, you have less fat, but then you have poorer metabolic health and you have a shorter lifespan. And if you look at the mice that were on a low protein, high carbohydrate diet, now all of them are positive, right? So you have actually a little bit more higher food intake, a little bit more fat, better metabolic health, and longer lifespan. If you have a low protein, high fat, now you have more food intake, lots of fat deposition, and reduced metabolic health and reduced lifespan. So what about people? So we actually had published one of the first key studies on this, and using the human, the CDC database, the NHANES. And so it turns out that, again, proteins control all these pro-aging genes. And so if you look at overall, today I'm not focusing on cancer, so I'm just going to talk about overall mortality. So those before the age of 65, those that had a low protein intake, so less than 10% of calories came from protein, they actually had a reduced mortality risk, or a major reduction in the mortality risk in the following, I think, 18 years, compared to those that had more than 20% of the calories coming from proteins. But this turned around, right? So when we looked at 65 and older, then those that have high protein or moderate protein intake, moderate was already sufficient, they displayed actually a reduced mortality, right? So this is, why is this? Well, probably at least one of the factors could be IGF-1. You see that in the up to age 65, the subjects that reported a low protein intake had the lowest levels of circulating IGF-1, then the moderate, and then the high. And so this is also suggesting that the survey is working very well. But you see 66 and above, there is no longer a significant difference. Why? Was aging already reduced IGF-1 levels tremendously, and so now the high protein intakes, the 75-year-old having a high protein intake has the same IGF-1 as a 50-year-old having a very low protein intake. Okay, so this is the importance of mechanisms and molecular biology and genetics that going along with the epidemiological data. Okay, so then the last part for today, I'm going to talk about low-carb diets. And now there's low-carb diets, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about, and then there are ketogenic diets. So I'm not going to fully talk about ketogenic diet. Why? Because I think that the great majority of people cannot do a true ketogenic diet, let's say 90% fat, 10% carbo, say 80% fat, 10% protein, 10% carbohydrate, or even less, right? So most people, that's not sustainable. So I'm just going to stay away from that. But it doesn't mean that that cannot have benefits. And I think especially in an acute setting, if the ketogenic diet is very extreme ketogenic diet are used to get somebody from point A to point B, let's say an acute weight loss, to then change and do some of the other diets that I'm going to talk about in the next module. So, not surprisingly, if you do have a very low carbohydrate diet, you have lots of benefits or apparent benefits. We don't know yet, but certainly benefits. And so, basically, after a very low carbohydrate diet, the level of triglycerides after 6 weeks of a low carbohydrate diet, after having the same high-fat meal causes less triglyceride to be in circulation. And if you look on the right, you see that most of the studies on very low carbohydrate diet, VLCDs, are causing a loss in fat mass, right? And a variable whether they also lose lean body mass or not. You have some studies showing yes, some studies show no. But if you look at the duration, this is very short studies, and so they make sense. And also, if you look at the CHO, the carbohydrate consumption is very low. So these are very tough type of studies where they consume anywhere from 0 carbohydrate to about 100 grams a day of carbohydrate, right? So these are again, very difficult, and I'm not going to represent them in these studies coming up. So these studies are more about the realistic low carbohydrate diet, right? So what if somebody has about 35% of energy coming from carbohydrates? And this is one study with 40,000 men, follow up for 20 years. And it's, what I just showed you was 40 days, and now this is a 20-year follow-up of 40,000 people, right? So what happens? Well, again, now we're looking at very different type of diet. So we're comparing men that had 57% carbohydrate diet, energy from carbohydrate diet, versus 37%, right? But again, this is probably representative of the, no, not probably, this is representative of the sort of extreme, the quintiles of what people do, what these 40,000 men did. So the group that had the lowest carb diet had about 37%. And if you look at diabetes, you actually see a twice as high risk of diabetes in those that had the low carbohydrate diet versus those that had the high carbohydrate diet. And this is particularly, well, this is only true if the consumption was of animal proteins and animal fats. And this is going to keep showing up in all kinds of studies. So when you look at low carbohydrate but high vegetable protein and fat score, then you no longer see these negative effects of a low carbohydrate diet on diabetes. So what about overall mortality? And this is a large study with 85,000 women or 44,000 men, and they followed for decades people on a low carbohydrate diet versus high carbohydrate diet. And again, now we're looking at 60% versus 37%, either animal-based or plant-based. And if you look at the mortality risk, so there is an increase, particularly in men, but also in women, in the overall all-cause mortality risk by having an animal-based low carbohydrate diet versus the animal-based high carbohydrate diet. And but this is actually turns around if it's a vegetable-based low carbohydrate diet. So the vegans, the vegetarians, etc., that having low carb, they seem to be doing pretty well. But again, it's a moderate low carb diet. It's not an extreme ketogenic diet. And this is cardiovascular mortality. Again, we see big effects. For example, in men, you see there's a 42% increased risk of cardiovascular mortality, and pretty close for women, although for women is only significant after adjustments. So if it's animal-based, low carb, it's bad for cardiovascular disease. But if it's vegetable-based, now it's actually good for cardiovascular disease. And this is a more recent study published by Lancet, public health, and looking at dietary carbohydrate intake and mortality. And you see actually here they actually go, and some of these are projections, but they go to very low, say 20% carbohydrate diet, and they propose that that's associated with about a 50-60% increase in overall mortality. And with the 50 to 60% energy from carbohydrate range being the ideal. And then as you go very high, 70, 80%, then you start to see some negative effect, although not what you see with the very low carbohydrate diets. So what about different studies, all kinds of different studies, and you see over and over all the studies listed there. Mortality is increased in those that have a high animal, a low carbohydrate, but with high animal fat and proteins. But in many different studies, the risk is actually decreased. The risk in mortality is decreased if it's a low carb, high plant fat and high plant proteins, and so this is the end of part one. And then in the next module, we're focusing on fasting and diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And so I hope to convince you that certain types of fasting, we'll focus on the good and the neutral and the bad. And but I hope that I will convince you that now we're moving from this, we're taking these extraordinary effects of calorie restriction, and we're understanding the molecular biology of aging, the genetics of aging, and we're beginning to now say, I think we're in the right moment to come up with different interventions that are a lot less invasive, that don't have the side effects, and reduce the burden, and so that the great majority of people can do it. Many people can do 1,800 calories. How many men can do a 1,800, 1,900 calorie a day diet and become and have a BMI of 18 or 19? Very few, right? So that's not feasible. But what is feasible, right? So what allows to get all these benefits, but not lose the muscle mass, and also not require chronic and continuous changes. Most people, I always say, if you ask somebody that drinks 4 coffees a day to go to 3 coffees a day, it's already difficult, right? Most people will turn that down. And so the future of dietary intervention really has to be about doing something that, if you ask 10 people that you know, 7 or 8 will say, yes, I think I can do this, but more importantly, I can do this for the rest of my life. And as we've already starting to see, the rest of your life might need changes, modification of that intervention, right? So that's also a little bit of what we're gonna talk about in the next module. So I'm just gonna take questions now. Okay. So some of the question, multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis, we are doing multiple clinical trials on multiple sclerosis. One is gonna start hopefully at USC very soon. And one is been going on for a couple of years in Italy. One was finished at Charité Hospital a couple of years ago, and this was a fasting mimicking diet, a single cycle of a fasting mimicking diet at multiple sclerosis. The quality of life, the initial results on quality of life were very positive, and actually a single cycle of the fasting mimicking diet was more effective in these patients compared to a 3 months continuous ketogenic diet. So very interesting results, but again, it was only about 45 patients, so now we need more studies. If results for women fasting been analyzed for any of the women have been part of the fasting mimicking diet studies, and we usually analyze the men and the women separately. Usually we get similar results. So it's the FMD, the fasting mimicking diet. It's been working both on men and women similarly, but as we get more and more data now, we're going to have about 3 clinical trials that are going to be published on FMD in the next year or so, and cardiometabolic markers. And so I think this also will be an opportunity to do analysis of sex-specific and age-specific, et cetera, et cetera. Is the growth hormone receptor deficiency the same as pituitary dwarfism? Yes, it can be, right? It doesn't have to be. So in this case, it's a growth hormone receptor mutation that these subjects have. There's about 350 in the world. It's not a pituitary mutation. There is also pituitary mutations. So there are mutations in like what's called Snell dwarfs and Ames dwarfs. There are mutations that are causing pituitary dwarfism. So the growth hormone is actually not being generated by the pituitary. Yeah, is there a difference between a protein coming from animal or plant sources? Yes, so lots of the slides that I talked about show that the intake from animal sources, from plant sources, can lead to very different, opposite results, in fact. So why is that? Well, we know that, first of all, if there's a self-regulatory effect of vegetable and vegetable protein. So it's extremely difficult if you, let's say, chickpeas or most of the legumes, it's extremely difficult to overeat, to have too much proteins, because it will take 2 pounds of legumes per day to have excess proteins, and the great majority of people cannot do that. And so, but then also the legumes, not so much the seeds and the nuts, but the legumes also have low essential amino acid levels, or at least levels of certain of the essential amino acids. And so then there's a double reason for why if you have a high plant-based diet, that can regulate the level of the intake of certain amino acids. And these are the same amino acids that can be key in pushing growth hormone, IGF-1, insulin, TOR, cis kinase, etc. Yeah, I'm 67 years old and healthy. What dietary recommendation you have? Next time I'm going to talk about the longevity diet. I encourage you to read my book. All the profits, or my profits, go to the foundation and the clinics of the foundation. But yeah, there are the longevity diet. It's really up to age 65, 70. But then there is a variation of the longevity diet where we basically say there should be more allowance for, let's say, eggs, more allowance for, maybe even white meat, certainly dairy products of certain kind, like yogurt. Lots of centenarian population have yogurt consumption. They have cheese consumption. So if someone gets in the 80s, 90s, or then the diet probably has to be more permissive. Obviously, there's again personalization, right? So if somebody is 80 and is suffering from cardiovascular disease, may not be such a good idea to have the cheeses and the meat, etc., etc. Or it may be a good idea to have it, but in a way that it does not accelerate the cardiovascular progression. Do all the proteins affect the increase of TOR cis kinase, or only protein obtained from it? All of them do, but again, in a different way. So based on the amino acid content of the protein, you can have a very high activation of TOR cis kinase, or very low activation. And so levels and type, right? So both of them matter, and the plant-based protein, not all of them, right? So some of them can have actually quite high levels of these amino acids, but certainly the legumes are pretty clearly established to have low levels of these pro-growth amino acids. HIV, we haven't done, we've been talking about HIV for a long time with some of the scientists at USC, but we never got anything started, unfortunately. So I don't have any information on HIV. Someone is asking about polyphenols. Could the difference between high protein from animal and plant sources, could it be due to polyphenols in the plants? Yeah, obviously when you eat more plant-based products, you also have more polyphenols and lots of other things, so we don't know. But certainly when you put it all together, and the Laron studies, the mouse growth hormone receptor deficiency, the protein deficiency, if you put it all together, you get a sense that it's really about, a lot of it is about protein levels and amino acids, and then there could be other things like the polyphenols, but they're not going to be the centerpiece, because there's only a few ways that you can make sense of all the studies put together. But yeah, any study can be explained by lots of different hypotheses. Yeah, so somebody's saying the studies on low carb were epidemiological. Yes, because of course you cannot do a 20-year study in humans on a low carb diet. At least nobody's done it so far. But the mouse study, for example, was a lifelong randomized. It's a mouse study, but of course, yeah, if you're talking about lifespan, you can do that in mice. You cannot do it in people. And so that study with the low carb is showing that much better to have a high carb, low protein diet than and the worst, or one of the worst was the low carb, high protein diet, as we will expect. ALS patients, no, we don't have anything in ALS patients yet. We're doing Huntington now studies, but we haven't started anything in ALS. ALS is going to be a tough one, But at some point, if we get funding, we'll also look at FMD and ALS. Yeah, I'm concerned about frailty and sarcopenia with lower protein diets. Absolutely, right? Absolutely. So this is the job of the doctor and the dietitian, to keep the amino acids low enough, and this is really the difficulties, right? To keep it low enough so the IGF-1 is just right. So we're now about to publish a meta-analysis on IGF-1 levels. It turns out that the mid-range levels are the ideal one, right? So you don't want to go too low. In fact, when you have people that have very low IGF-1, those are the ones that do the worst, right? So and I just showed the data from COVID, right? So the frail are doing very poorly with COVID. So you don't want the protein levels to go so low that you have sarcopenia, but also maybe immunosuppression, frailty, etc., etc. And so it's a trick to keep it sufficiently high to not lose lean body mass and not have other issues, but not so high that you now start having the chronic diseases. I'm going to talk a little bit about type 2 diabetes next time. I'll just say a few things about FMD and type 1 and pancreatic regeneration in mice, a study that we published a few years ago. Now we have a clinical trial that is about to start at Gaslini Children's Hospital on type 1 diabetes and FMD in Genova, Italy, but we have no data yet. It's better to do a low-carb, plant-based, high-fat and protein from plant sources rather than a high-carb, plant-based for cardiovascular disease and cancer optimization. Yeah, the best seems to be a mostly plant-based, relatively low-carb. If you put it all together, even the Lancet study, say that if it's plant-based, the 40 to 55% carbohydrate. That seems to energy from carbohydrate. That seems to be the common denominator that it's hard to argue with. I mean, there's almost no negative studies. If you have a mostly plant-based 40 to 55% carbohydrate diet, that seems to be ideal. Then the protein should be kept low, but not too low, and the fats should be kept mostly fairly high. It could be 30% or so, but olive oil, nuts, salmons. So it's very important. The sources seem to be very important. Again, not too much in the vegan side of things, because then you get to frailty. For example, a recent study showing fractures can be a certain type of fracture. I think hip fracture was 2.5 times higher in the vegans compared to the meat eaters. So yeah, so then that's evidence of how you can go from one problem to the other. How much genetics, how important are genetics? Very important. But some things we see, as I just showed you, you see some things we show in mice, even yeast, flies, mice, and humans. So some things are even interspecies effective, right? But some things are, personalized and need to be personalized, right? So then that's a job of the healthcare professional. How do I take the things that seem to be, very effective in all kinds of organisms, and how do I then personalize it for each genetic background that I have to do with. Yeah, so somebody's asking about a 16-8 diet together with the fasting diet, but my weight fluctuates and I struggling to get back to the optimum weight. I think I'll read the book, the longevity diet book. There is actually a technique, I think, to it. Like say 12 hours, 16 hours may be a little bit too long. Say 12 hours. Is probably best, but you have to do this all the time. And I also talk about the plant-based, lots of food, eat more, not less, but eat more of calorie scarce food. And also I talk about for people that tend to gain weight, breakfast, always breakfast, and we're going to talk about the damage of skipping breakfast next time, and then skip lunch and substitute lunch with a very low calorie, healthy, low sugar snack, and then dinner, or have lunch and skip dinner, at least I would say 5 times a week. So that could be a good technique to make sure that that the FMD, if the FMD alone is not working, and the time restricted eating is not working, then I think you need an extra step. It doesn't have to be every day of the week. It's probably good to have 2 or 3 days where you can enjoy food 3 times a day, 3 meals plus a snack. But let's say Monday through Friday, I've been doing this for 20 years. Monday to Friday, no lunch for me, and I substitute. I just have coffee for lunch, and it's always worked very well for me in keeping me from keep gaining weight. Yeah, so there's questions about the FMD. I think let's just do that next time because we're going to talk about the FMD. It's harder to eat low carb when plant-based since they come with more carbs. Yeah, I think again, it's each person has to find something that they can live with. So I would say if the diet is mostly plant-based, or it's got to be as plant-based as possible, don't worry so much about getting the carbs too low. You saw these examples are not 10% carbs. They're like 37% of energy, 37 to 40% of energy coming from carb. And there was the lower carb group, right? So, so I think that even if you get down to 50%, that's already pretty low carb if it comes from good sources. There's not a lot of starches involved. So I think it's if the low carb is not working, then start acting on the starches, the pasta, the bread, the potatoes. So then substitute those with more of the vegetables, legumes, etc., and that should do it. Fish versus red meat, of course fish, but fish with low mercury and maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And red meat is just over and over and over coming out of the bottom of most of the research conducted. So yeah, if you can avoid red meat, you should do it. Yeah, grass-fed versus, that's an interesting question, right? We just finished a study on that, and I cannot tell the results yet. But we took mice and put them in on a sort of grass-fed organic Western diet versus none, you know. So soon enough we'll publish on that, but that's an interesting question and we don't know the answer to it yet. Methionine restriction, yes, methionine restriction seems to be at the center of protein restriction. Methionine restriction can also be at the center of frailty. So again, it has to be, this has to be, the diets have to be carefully designed for the patients so they don't get into trouble, you know. Yeah, it's a good question. What's IGF-1 that is too low? It looks like if you especially get below, let's say 100, something is not right, you know. So I would say in most cases, if it gets below 100, there may be some issue, malnourishment, some inflammation, or some other issues that are driving IGF-1 down. So IGF-1, as we see from the Laron people that I showed you earlier, IGF-1 can be extremely low, lifelong, and that's not a problem at all because lots of systems can make local IGF-1. So, you know, the brain and almost every cell type. So whenever it is needed, the IGF-1 can be made locally. The one that is made by the liver can be very low, lifelong, so that's not a problem. So if you see low IGF-1, it may be the consequence of something that is going on with the patient, because it's going on in the patient, and so it's probably good to take a look at the blood and see if there's something that is not right. Yeah, sports. So I get this question all the time: is people that do sports should they have more proteins? In some cases, yes. In lots of cases, no. Right. So, but of course, if you do lots of sports and you start seeing losing muscle mass, yes, that's probably evidence that you're going to need not only more proteins, but maybe more animal-based proteins or it could be even vegan. You know, there are lots of athletes that are vegan, even professional athletes. But then you have to pay attention the seeds, the nuts versus the legumes, right? So you have to have a sufficient level of certain amino acids. Is there a big difference between 12, 16, and 20 hours? Yes, we're going to talk about that next week, and I think that's all the time that I have. Thank you very much.